Welcome to In This Body, a podcast where we dive deep into the potent power of embodiment. I'm your host, Ailey, Jolie, a psychotherapist deeply passionate about living life fully from the wisdom within your very own body. The podcast In This Body is a love letter to embodiment, a podcast dedicated to asking important questions like, how does connecting to your body change your life? How does connecting to your body enhance your capacity to love more deeply and live more authentically? And how can collective embodiment alter the course of our shared world? Join me for consciously curated conversations with leading experts. Each episode is intended to support you in reconnecting to your very own body. This podcast will be available for free wherever you get your podcasts, making it easy for you to stay connected to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Welcome back to another episode of In This Body. I'm your host, Ailey Jolie, and today I'm excited to be joined by Emilia Thompson, a highly qualified sports biomedicine expert, nutritionist, and certified life coach, whose personal journey with disordered eating and body image has shaped the compassionate approach she brings to her clients today. Emilia's story is one of transformation, starting from a foundation of academic excellence in biomedicine and sports nutrition to her own struggles with body image, emotional eating, and the pursuit of control through extreme fitness regimes. It was only after years of battling binge eating disorder, restriction, and extreme body preoccupation that Emilia found healing through mindfulness, meditation, and self-compassionate practices. In this episode, we will dive deep into Emilia's unique coaching method that is inspired by her own recovery, the ETPHD method, which blends evidence-based nutrition with mindfulness to help individuals cultivate a healthier relationship with food and their bodies. Emilia will share how her personal and professional experiences have shaped her work. We will also together explore the role of embodiment in healing the relationship we have with food and exercise, and investigate how diet culture is hiding in the wellness world, but also the somatic world today. Emilia, thank you so much for joining me today. Welcome to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. My first question for you today is, what does being in your body mean to you?
What a beautiful question. It means to me feeling connected with myself and being able to honor my body needs. I think for me, my background with not being in my body is not being able to listen to my hunger, not being able to listen to my fullness, not being able to listen to my need for rest, and being very externally driven through tracking food or tracking exercise or tracking steps. And so that was the main focus for me for coming back into my body. So now I really can, it's almost like a sign that I can tell if I'm in my body or not is, am I eating mindfully? Am I exercising and resting well? Those are my indications almost that I feel like I'm very much in my body. So yeah, really being able to listen to my internal cues.
For the listener who is unaware of the work you do today, could you explain both what you offer in your work today and some of the path that led you to your offering?
Sure. I like that you said some of the path because sometimes I feel like I could go on for hours and then I work predominantly with people who are looking to improve their relationship with food and their body image. And actually, originally, I'm a registered nutritionist and my PhD is in exercise physiology. So originally, my work was very much focused on food and exercise. Through my own experiences with disordered eating, I realized actually body image and a lot of work with the body is almost essential when it comes to improving your relationship with food. But because my background was very scientific, very nutrition focused, there was no holistic nature to it. It was just very hard science. I'd had no idea that in order to improve your relationship with food, you needed to improve your relationship with your body. So my background, I lived with disordered eating since I was about 15 or 16, and it manifested as binge eating disorder for on and off for 15-ish years. And as a result of my disordered eating, I fell into bodybuilding because it glorified disordered eating. It said you can have all of these food rules and really focus on keeping your body small and exercising all the time, and you can win a trophy, and you can take all of these pictures and glorify it and come across as somebody who works really hard. And so I thought, oh, this is great, so I'll do that. And fell into that world and realized it was just another world of disordered eating. And only really through suppose sharing my own experience. I used to lecture in sport nutrition, so I was lecturing at the time of competing, and so I just started writing blogs about my own experience with competing and disordered eating, and bringing in some of the evidence that I knew from my work. And as I was doing so, people kind of started crawling out of the woodwork, so to speak, and saying, "Oh, that's me too. My coach just tells me just to, have more willpower, just to keep focusing on what I'm doing." And I'm struggling with binge eating, and I'm struggling with, food preoccupation, body preoccupation. And so my work kind of grew from that. And now I work with a team of coaches, and we all work with people who have, sit on the spectrum of disordered eating in some way. We have dietitians on the team who work with people with eating disorders, and, nutritionists and personal trainers who work people who are maybe in the fitness and wellness space, but feel really preoccupied by food and body in some way, just to really find peace with food, whatever that looks like.
What do you think that transference of eating disorder or disordered eating behaviors from kind of their original, how we would originally conceptualize them, into the fitness realm isn't often spoken about? Because I've heard about it in almost everyone's story that I've worked with. They've had some time where they maybe really got into spinning and like then were the person at the spin studio all the time or with bodybuilding. I'm just curious to hear from you why you think that part of the conversation has been so missed when we speak about recovery.
It's a great question. Shame is probably at the forefront of this, the
Mm,
shame of disordered eating. And interestingly, this is a topic that I've been discussing a little bit more recently, in that we've removed a lot of the shame around, for example, overeating, emotional eating, binge eating. If you look on social media, you can see people are relatively open about talking about these things. About 50% of people that come to work with us also experience purging behaviors. And there are a lot of them in the fitness space. And nobody talks about that side of things. It's like we're kind of happy to pull back the shame cloak to some degree, but not fully. And I think, shame just needs someone to start talking about it, right? To kind of release it. And I
mm.
think for me, I've always said I've been quite lucky in my career, because I was one of the first people just to go, this is what it is. And once I kind of pulled on that thread, more people were willing to kind of open up and say these things. So I think one of the key drivers of this is shame. I think on
Mhm.
top of that, there is, of course, this huge crossover with diet culture in the fitness space.
Mhm.
And diet culture, of course, we make so much money from the diet culture, makes so much money from saying, work harder, be better, be thinner. If you are thinner, then you'll be more successful, etc., etc. And I think there's too much money to be made by
Mm.
us saying, you just have to want it enough. Coaches, a majority of fat loss coaches or fat loss programs are underpinned by the message of just follow these rules, just have more willpower, and you will achieve this. Now, if you're someone who's struggling with binge eating and you see this message constantly over and over again, you internalize that as you are the failure. You don't even have enough willpower to stick to a diet. And so immediately you begin to feel less than, because you've been fed this narrative. You stick to this, you will be skinnier, you will be better. You are a better person. And so you start to feel consistently like, oh, I can't do this. I'm not good enough. I don't have this willpower to get there. It escalates that shame, and shame stifles us, doesn't it? It stops us from being able to
Mm.
speak about things. And so we don't talk about it. We just try another diet, and we think, well, if I try harder this time, I'll be able to do it. So I think a lot of it is to do with diet culture, and that kind of cloak of shame over our entire lives, but over specifically that area of our lives.
Mhm. One thing that I was thinking of as you were speaking is oftentimes I've seen the pendulum swing with clients where they've really been in that this isn't working, I'm doing all the thing. And then the lack of like momentum or willpower or motivation not necessarily in regards to fat loss, but in all areas of their lives just starts to dissipate because of the diet culture messaging and the fact that diets don't work in that way. But one thing I have seen that I've been very curious, and maybe you've seen it too, and maybe you have greater insight with it, is there'll be like this really big pendulum swing. And then it's like I'm doing all the bodybuilding things and I have all of the momentum and it's all so calculated. And I found that so interesting. So I am curious to hear if that's something you've also noticed
Yeah.
and if you have any ideas as to why.
In my experience, I think that shift feels like you are improving. I use
Mm.
improving in, quotation marks here. Um, in that, in fact, I spoke about this the other day, as I'd seen people talking about using bodybuilding as a means for disordered eating recovery. And
Mm.
I kind of got my back up a little bit because it does feel like you finally have willpower. It feels like you are, let's take an example of someone, for example, with disordered eating who is maybe regularly overeating or binge eating. And they've tried lots of different diets that doesn't work. And then they've entered into this space, let's say like extreme dieting, bodybuilding. And so they have this community that says, that's really behind them that says, focus on your body, focus on food, and you've got this, and you could win a trophy. And it becomes very, almost becomes a lot of people's identity, right? They take it all on. And so they begin to feel like, okay, I'm in this community of people who are all doing this together. We're all together, and community can be so powerful.
Mhm.
And for at least for the short term, what will usually happen in these extremes is that you'll follow a bit of a meal plan. So it'll be very regimented. So there is no space to think, oh, maybe I will have a flexible meal here. Maybe I will eat slightly differently or eat with my family. That you just can't do it. So, someone who overeats might find that they always overeat when they eat pizza. Let's be really basic here, right? They always overeat when they eat pizza. If you're doing something like bodybuilding, you don't have the opportunity to do that. And
Mhm.
so you just kind of plaster over it. You say, these are your meals. This is all you're going to do. It's quite easy to stick to something like that for the short term.
Mhm.
And with bodybuilding, for example, or any extreme diet, there are phases you usually stick to. So it's like a diet phase and then a growing phase. And if you do have a pizza, it's controlled in the sense of they'll say have a cheat meal. And so you don't have the guilt because you're doing something that's programmed into this extreme
Mhm.
way of eating. And so after a few months, 6 months, I know competitors who come to work with me after 4 years of competing. I competed for 4 years. Um, you almost feel like you've improved. You say, "Oh, I'm not overeating anymore." You are, but it's framed as a helpful cheat meal, for example, or
Mhm.
you know, I exercise the right amount for myself now. It's like you exercise the right amount for a bodybuilder, but that's not necessarily healthful. So I think it it just provides, I think it provides like a bit of a plaster and a bit of a false narrative of I don't want to use the word healing, but I suppose yeah, healing your relationship with food. It really just takes you in another direction and we love extremes, don't we? It's
Mhm.
I think we use food, and I'm sure you've seen this a lot, and I'd love to hear your insight on this. Like, we definitely use food and exercise as ways to almost, one, like build identities, and two, just give us a source of focus or purpose that
Mhm.
feels a lot easier than maybe other things. And I see this a lot with people who, a lot of our clients start to reevaluate their careers or their relationships as time goes on, because they've removed this big focus that's been on food and body for so long. They then create space for other things, but we live in a world that celebrates bodies and diets, so it's very easy to go hard into these spaces. Um, it's a much nicer, easier focus for us than, you know, let's look at our relationships, let's look at our
Mhm.
connections. And so I think that's why we fall into the extremes quite easily.
It's so interesting to hear you speak of this, and I am really curious to hear from you if you've come across, and I'm sure you have. I know when I went through my eating disorder recovery, the psychiatrist that I was working with at one time told me I wasn't allowed to take walks that were longer than 10 minutes. And he said movement and exercise are off the table until I had regular eating. And then I went to a private treatment center and she had a very similar rule. There was no exercise, no yoga, no stretching, like nothing. And I know for myself, I had the opposite. Instead of like that momentum kind of going through bodybuilding, everything in my life stopped and movement and exercise became this very scary piece. And I'm curious to hear from you because you have worked with so many people through this process. If there are some kind of dominant conceptions of how we bring movement or exercise back into someone's life when they've had disordered eating, if you've come across maybe what I experienced, which is this belief that you're a person who has an eating disorder, is recovering from an eating disorder, so you should just sit still and never move again. I would love to hear more from you.
It's really, really interesting because because probably where we're positioned in the fitness space, it's very rare that we will work with anyone who doesn't do any exercise or any movement at all. But we certainly have people come to work with us who have been told that in the past. And one of the reasons
Mhm.
they do, I think, feel that they can work with us is because, at least with the disordered eating realm, that's not something that we would do. And as I said, we have a psychotherapist and a dietitian on the team who work in the eating disorder realm. And so I'm mindful of my own scope here when I say prescription for people with living with eating disorder. Um, but for us, it's very much about framing exercise from the place of, embodiment and
Mhm.
healthful movement. And actually, I can give a bit of an example from people who experience, for example, hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is where people lose their periods because usually because of chronically low energy availability. Usually, there are some other factors there. And the blanket statement for people with HA is no exercise and no movement.
Mhm.
And I find it very destructive because of, and I don't know what your experience with this was, but just because you are taking away such a, often like a really helpful source, a helpful outlet, a helpful source of self-regulation, of especially things like yoga, like embodiment and things that are really, really supportive of a good relationship with food. To blanket take it away, I think actually causes more stress. Again, I'm mindful of my scope here, but causes more stress, and um, harm than good. So usually what we have to do with people, we usually do have to help people reassess what their relationship with exercise is. And it's so interesting what people internalize as the norm as time goes on. So if you have had disordered eating habits for a while or disordered relationship with exercise, you may well have internalized exercising every day as the norm or never resting as the norm, especially if you're in a space where, let's take a running club, and everyone exercises every day, and a rest day is a 10K run, and that's the norm for people. And so we never will say this is exactly what you need to do for exercise. That's not how we work, but we will say it's interesting that you feel that 7 days a week exercise is the norm. And I think usually with relationships with exercise, it does come with relationships with food as well. And we do try and broach it all from, again, that kind of living in your body. How does this feel? And usually we get a little bit of pushback initially when we say, let's pull it back slightly and let's just see how this feels. Initially, most people will say this is horrendous. And then after a month, they'll say, oh, this feels great. But again, it's interesting that you're told that in eating disorder recovery, because again, of course, at that point, you're not necessarily able to live in your body. And of course, you do
Mhm.
have this stress regulation there. But the whole point of, healing your relationship with food and moving through disordered eating is to come back into yourself as opposed to
Mhm.
just saying, yes, no, let's have this really dichotomous, you can't do this or you can't do that. And so we try and avoid that at all costs. And but it is interesting. And did you feel like you had to stick with that, or did you find another way to move through it out of interest?
Yeah. No, I did stick with it. And I
Yeah.
think at that specific time, it was so incredibly challenging. But it was also like one of the moments where I did pause and go, oh my goodness, I must be like really sick. I must be like quite unwell. And so that was like definitely helpful. What was deeply unhelpful was that it gave me no framework in which to bring exercise and movement back into my life 3 years, 4 years later, after I like deeply internalized this message, I didn't know how to engage with fitness culture without feeling activated or less than, or like I could be doing more, or that I was like being now I was being bad, or as someone who has a history of an eating disorder, I should never be in a gym again. And so
Mhm.
then I had to work through all those pieces. And because I didn't have a frame, I definitely fell into the culture I was around at that time. I was in the West Coast in Vancouver, which is similar to California, which is like we don't go to a fancy bar, we go to a fancy spin class, and this is how we connect. And so I definitely deeply fell into that. And I would love to hear from you, because you did kind of sprinkle it into your answer there, how you work with someone when they are in a culture that's maybe similar to Vancouver or parts of California, West Coast, and the social thing that you do is often going to a gym class together or Pilates class together, and it's all kind of quite normalized. How do you work with someone when the culture around them is actually the more disordered piece than maybe even they are?
It's such a great question, and we do work with people in this situation. And honestly, I think a lot of this comes down to not necessarily changing those behaviors, because you don't want to, of course, remove people's source of connection, but
Mhm.
more so support people in how they show up to these situations more than anything else. So, making sure they're kind of certain on their intention behind what they're doing, and encourage them to get curious about that. Are you showing up for the social and because you enjoy the way Pilates feels, or are you showing up for something else? And the key problems usually here are the comparison and the conversations. Those are the two things that consistently come up when you're in these kind of, I'm not going to use the word toxic environments, challenging environments when it comes to exercise, and challenging communities. And so I really try and empower people to understand, think concepts like embodiment and concepts like intuitive movement, etc., so that they actually feel empowered to go into these situations where they can actually have these conversations if they feel comfortable to do so.
Mhm.
So, if, for example, a weight loss conversation comes up, even if they're on a fat loss journey, that's sort of a side note, they feel like they can say, "Oh, it's interesting that you focus on fat loss. One thing I'm doing is this," and really empowering them to feel confident with education. So why am I doing it this way? And to actually use their voice to talk about it. And that usually works relatively well, because they feel, our clients often move through a phase where they start to actually want to help other people and talk
Mhm.
about things. And that's great if they want to go down that road and they can open up these conversations. But the other side of it is boundary setting and recognizing when you can just obviously walk out of a conversation or change the topic. And we often try and make light of it as much as possible, because, as you know, boundary setting can be really hard, especially in an environment where you don't necessarily know everyone very well. But we do try and make light of it a little bit and think about ways that you can either exit a conversation, or just change the topic, and really it comes down to those things. And I think with the comparison piece, that can be a very difficult one to get out of. And so
Mhm.
I'm not a psychologist or a psychotherapist, but we do, some gentle thought work around comparison. So just through mindfulness work of recognizing, I'm in this class and I can see that I'm looking at this person's legs when we're on a spin bike. Can we, stop that thought? Can we replace that thought? Can I change that comparison thought to thought around gratitude about my own body, and really working on things like body functionality, appreciating our body for what they are able to do, etc. Really building up our own body image so that when we notice these comparison thoughts, we can kind of stop them in the moment. And that is through body image work, it is through mindfulness work.
Mhm.
And again, trying to make light of it as much as possible and taking a really curious approach. So I think as well, a lot of people who experience disordered eating are really hard on themselves, and they say, "Oh my God, I'm criticizing this person, or I'm comparing against this person." Let's just replace this criticism and this comparison with curiosity. Interesting that I find myself comparing every time I come to this class. Why might that
Mhm.
be? How can I replace that with something kind or something compassionate towards myself or other people? And so the actual act of exercise is not changing, but it's
Mhm.
just the intention and the conversations that we have in person and also in our own minds, of course, around what that means.
So much of what I'm hearing you say is kind of sprinkling in or bringing in this sense of embodiment and like, oh, a view that is no longer viewing the body as an object or something to be fixed, but like a place to live. I would love to hear from you how you kind of weave in embodiment and just overall, like, what is the process that you take people on? Because I'm obviously value what you do and how you show up. And I think it's quite special and different. So I would love to hear from you what that process is when you're working with someone or one of the coaches you have trained is working with someone.
It's so interesting because, I probably don't use the word embodiment when I work with people,
Yeah.
hardly ever, um, because we meet people in the space of food.
Mhm.
So they often don't care about embodiment
Mhm.
or mindfulness or acceptance. None of these things are particularly relevant to them, or they feel that they're not necessarily relevant until they've kind of moved through it and they can understand where that comes from. So I meet people where they are. We work on things like, okay, let's learn to listen to your hunger. Let's learn
Mhm.
to listen to your fullness. How does hunger show up in your body? Do you have a grumbling stomach? Do you have low energy? What does physical hunger feel like versus what does emotional hunger feel like? Do you have a craving for a specific food like chocolate or ice cream? That may well be emotional hunger. Do you feel like you could eat a bowl of, I don't know, an omelette? Okay, that might be more physical hunger. Does it come on very quickly? Emotional hunger. Does it, so we work a lot on that, and we work on things like fullness versus satiety. So a lot of people who have worked in who have been in kind of diet culture for a while know what stomach fullness feels like because they pile their plates up with vegetables. They don't eat any fat, but they eat loads and loads of vegetables, stir fries, and pile their plate up really high, and they say, I'm really full. I've eaten a big huge meal and yet I'm still hungry. I say, okay, well, that's interesting. You are stomach full, possibly, and that's really
Mhm.
important because our stomach responds to that stretch and tells us that we're full. But our stomach also responds to calorie intake. And actually,
Mhm.
you've got this huge bowl of food and you're wondering why you're hungry, but where are the healthy fats in that meal? Where's the protein in that meal? And so we begin to help people understand, okay, this is stomach fullness versus this is satiety. We look at things like food enjoyment. How does this food make me feel in my body? An example I will always use is I absolutely love takeaway pizza and it genuinely soothes my soul. And I comfort eat and
Mhm.
I enjoy it. And it's about encouraging people to say, how does that food make me feel after I've eaten it? Is it shameful? Is it comforted? And so we use food as a entry point into embodiment, and the same then we then move on to the body piece of that. So food is kind of the start point. And then we start to move on to exercise, and we see again, how does that exercise feel? Usually we'll combine it initially. So we'll say, let's choose what you're going to eat before you exercise. How did you feel when you moved, when you had that meal beforehand, versus how did you feel when you skipped breakfast and then you exercised? How did that feel in your body? And so again, it's all just through the lens of exercise, really, and food, at least initially. And then once people feel more confident in those flexing those muscles, so to speak, they then often will just naturally start to realize how they feel in their body when they have an argument with someone or when they're, at work and they're feeling anxious. They begin to notice that feeling of anxiety in their body because they've started thinking about how does it feel to move this weight? How does it feel when I'm exhausted and I haven't taken a rest day? So again, it's I think the way that we do it is very much through the language of, fitness.
Mhm.
Um, and then underpinning that, of course, at ETP, the back end, we say this is how we're incorporating things like acceptance and mindfulness and embodiment into people's lives without necessarily selling it as such. And that's always been really important to me. I've always thought, I see one of my imposter syndrome um things is my eloquence. I've always thought people are so much more eloquent than me and they can articulate all of this this research and these theories so much better than I can. And I always have to say, but that's not what I'm trying to do. I know these things.
Mhm.
I'm trying to be eloquent to the people who don't understand what that means often. They may well do, but I'm trying to speak to those people. So that's actually how I always reframe to help me with my own imposter syndrome. Um, because that's where I want to be. I want to help people that don't need to know about the research necessarily.
Absolutely. I do find the language of embodiment oftentimes to be such a barrier.
Mhm.
Um, it's something that when I originally started my practice, I was as obsessed with it as I am now, people being in their body and having that type of connection. But I very quickly learned that most people aren't so interested in that. They don't understand it. It doesn't fit in with their other goals. And so, similar to you, I kind of did a sideways way of like, if I write about the relationships people have to others, they'll eventually get curious about the relationship they have with themselves. And the relationship they have with themselves is foundational to the relationship they have with their body. So I got like a little bit sneaky. So I love that we both kind of share this, like, how can I have this in here behind all of these other kind of pieces?
Yeah.
Um, I would love to hear from you when you are working with someone or just your experience of now having coaches work with people, and I'm sure hearing their experiences. What are some of the common kind of roadblocks or barriers that people experience that make this process more challenging?
There's a lot of it is this diet culture. Diet culture is the roadblock.
Mm,
I think I need to make a disclaimer. Also, by the way, is in that I'm not anti-weight loss in any way
mhm,
at all. So when I'm talking about diet culture, I'm not saying if you think that you want fat loss, none of this applies to you because
mhm,
that's separate. Diet culture is the narrative that says leaner is better. It's not weight loss as a whole. So I think it's just important to say that.
yeah.
But I think that is the roadblock. We have been told for so long if you listen to your body, you will just eat cake all the time. If you listen to your body, you're never going to go to the gym. If you listen to your body, you will gain loads of weight. And that is the narrative that we've had, especially as millennials, for our entire lives. And remember, if this happens, you will be less than. You
Mhm,
will be. And so then you see my social media and I'm saying, listen to honor your hunger, honor your fullness. And they're like, well, that might be fine for you because you're in the societally accepted body. But for me, that's not okay because if I do that, this is what will happen. It's happened before. I will gain weight. I will feel crap in myself. I will be less than, people will not love me, etc. So
mhm,
I really believe that we just inherently have this fear, piled onto us for our entire lives of if you live in your body, you will gain weight, you will be less than. And
mhm,
it's so sad to see this kind of weight bias so prevalent in so many of us. And, I hold my hands up and say 10 years ago, I really was a product of my millennial environment. And I really had to work through that internalized weight bias that I had. And actually, it's so interesting because some of us can own that we have it on the outside, and so we can say, "Oh, I do recognize that I'm judgmental in this area," but we don't necessarily hold the mirror to ourselves and say, "Oh, but I also experience that for myself, and I also have this internalized thin ideal where somewhere inside I think that thinner I am, the better that I am, is manifesting things like, guilt and shame if we step on the scales and we weigh more, guilt and shame if we eat certain foods, guilt and shame if our clothes don't fit anymore. We really believe that in some way we are less than as a result of that. And if that does come up for anyone, then I really recommend that you look at like do some reading around things like weight bias and this internalized thin ideal because it's so prevalent. And I think the main roadblock is fear, and it's perpetuated by a lot of the fitness space that I'm in really do perpetuate this because they'll make light of it. They'll say me having unconditional permission to eat, which is a core construct of intuitive eating, where we really do honor our hunger, feel this, listen to
mhm,
our bodies. And then it will be them eating loads and loads of donuts, and people are like, me too. If I let myself have one, I just eat the whole box, and that's me too. So I don't do this. And it's just this narrative is born out of misinformation, lack of education, um, and plays into especially our millennial fear, but this fear of allowing ourselves to be within ourselves because what might happen is weight gain. And I
mhm.
hate that it comes down to that. But it's what we've made weight gain mean for ourselves, I think.
So interesting that you speak of the fitness culture in that way because I'm so far removed from that, like have no idea, not my perceptual awareness at all. And I would love to hear from you a little bit more about that culture. Like, what are the things that you have seen that are a little bit of like yellow red flags for someone who might be there, is like starting to get like very lost in whatever's going on over there that's not super healthy. So that's my first question for you. And then I would also love to circle back and speak about the infusion of diet culture into this word like wellness, because I do think wellness and fitness oftentimes blend together in this way. So yeah, my first question about fitness culture and people that might be walking down that path, and then I want to circle back.
Sure. It's a shame because I do love the fitness space. I really love being in it.
Mm,
Like any industry, and I'm sure it's the same for you, there are fantastic pieces to that. We're in such a privileged position to be able to support people. But then there are also the darker sides of things of, again, misinformation. And the thing with the fitness space is that a lot of people come through the personal training qualification and then they're not given any extra support, and we are in such a prime position to support people, and it's
mm,
amazing, but because we're not given the tools to do that, it can become destructive and then just really, really unhelpful. The kind of amber, yellow, red flags that you will come up against are, people who sell diets as a means to overcome disordered eating, or they'll say
mm.
people that use words like willpower, that use words that self-control, about like self-control, who really put personal responsibility at the forefront of everything. And if you think about disordered eating recovery, it's not your fault that you experience disordered eating, but it is your responsibility. And often people who experience disordered eating are already quite critical of themselves and already feel like they haven't been doing enough. And so they are often in this prime position to take on that blame and to say, you're right, it is my responsibility. It is often, I am the failure. So just tell me what to do and I'm going to try harder. And a lot of fitness messaging really, really falls into that and says, just give me 8 weeks and I'll show you what you can achieve if you really put your mind to it, if you're really dedicated, if you're really motivated. And then they'll sell it with fat loss, of course, a fat loss transformation picture as an example. Um, Anyone who sort of, I would say usually transformation pictures are more often than not a red flag for any sort of work. If you experience disordered eating, I would say usually avoid people or work that uses these,
Yeah,
because
thank
I'm trying to be like a little bit balanced here, but I'll never use them. I will say that 10 years ago I did use them before I knew
you.
any better. And I know better, we do better. And because what they say is they'll say the kind of better ones, quote unquote, will say this is about mindset. This is not about their body. And yet the body is the picture.
Thank you.
And when you have a better mindset, you have weight loss. It's complete crap. Of course it is.
Yes.
Yeah. And it says the body's most important thing. So, again, if we come back to one of my earlier points around relationship with food being so intricately linked with the relationship with body, if it's anyone who sells bodies as an indicator of health or mindset doesn't really understand body image and therefore doesn't understand relationship with food. Like they're saying, I don't really get this. On the whole, again, there may be some exceptions in here. This is my personal opinion on this. So if you'd experienced disordered eating, avoid people who you know think that you have the same 24 hours in a day. I mean, my gosh, I'm so glad I didn't subscribe to that when I had it before I had a baby, because now I have a baby. I'm like, oh my God, I feel like I have 20 minutes in a day. Um, but anyone who kind of puts that personal responsibility at the forefront, without any understanding of anything else, really, really important. Of course, there's some responsibility in here. Anyone who uses these fat loss transformation pictures and uses this as any indication of anything other than it's fat loss. And ideally, probably most people, again, not all, won't be using them at all. Um, and anyone really who says the words willpower or self-control, that of course there's an element of self-control with anything that we do, and delayed gratification, and but you look at the language that people are using when it comes to these things. Usually the most enticing stuff is probably the red flag. Like,
Mm,
I actually wrote something on this yesterday around, I'm never going to be a preferred choice at ETPHD for recovery from binge eating if Susan down the road is saying this is what recovery from binge eating looks like and puts a transformation picture up there. I
Yeah.
expect you to say, I'm going to go work with Susan because look at this fat loss transformation I can get whilst I heal my relationship with food. Whereas I'm over here saying, these are some of the reasons why you might binge eat, and here's how we can tackle them. Not going to be your preferred choice. And usually, when people come to work with us, they apply 4 or 5 times before they start to work with us
Mm.
because we're not exciting in that way, and it's not visibly what you want to see.
Yeah.
We may get results like that, but we don't talk about them. We don't share them. So yeah, really any sort of image focused work, I think is probably something you want to look at.
You're touching on something that I have often felt, and I don't know if I've necessarily had language for it, but I've always had such a pretty strong avoidance professionally, and it's out there around this like heal your disordered eating or eating disorder, and your mindset will be great, and your life will be great, and you'll no longer binge. And my life is so fabulous. Here I am, kind of photo on Instagram. I've always had this really strong aversion. And I think as you were speaking, one thing that was going through my mind, I had just even had a little moment of clarity, which I'm grateful for you for, because I made the choice fairly early in my career to step away from the disordered eating realm. And the reason why wasn't because I didn't love the work or the people or my clients or any part of it. It was because I live in a thin ideal. I have Eurocentric beauty and body standards. And I was really exhausted from getting into the work with my clients and finding out the reason why they chose me as their therapist is that they believed that I had figured out how to recover from an eating disorder and still be in a very petite body. And that for me was so exhausting and also so deeply uncomfortable that I was like, I don't want to be making my money have people pay me for something that I can genuinely never deliver and also is so deeply flawed and a thought process that isn't inherently theirs. It's just one through diet culture. And I'm curious how you potentially work with that, because even though you're not doing flashy marketing, I wasn't either. And it still kind of found me. How do you work with that belief when you're like, I get a hunch that might be why they're here?
This is such a great point because I've battled this for as long as I can remember. And I hold my hands up when I was in bodybuilding and I first started talking about this work, I probably capitalized on it, not necessarily intentionally. And when I was aware of it, I changed my behaviors. But I constantly battle with this because I am quite a raging feminist, and I very much think if I want to live in my body, if I'm on holiday and I take a picture of myself in a bikini, I want to be able to say, I'm on a beach in a bikini, and I'm okay to share that. I want to share that. I love my body, and so for a long time I've battled with if I do this, I'm perpetuating the thin ideal, and then people are going to work with me because I'm in this body. And I've been very mindful of it postpartum as well, of just what I share. I never shared, how many weeks pregnant I am because it's such a vulnerable time. And I don't want people to think, well, if she eats like that and she exercises like that, she can keep her body like this when she has a baby. So that's what I need to do. I just don't want to play into it. So I've been very mindful of that. Um, I think part of the reason why I love our work is that we sit in a space in fitness that we're really needed, and I really really believe that the work that we do is really needed. Um, Unfortunately, people are in the fitness space often because of this aesthetic pull, and so in some way I've had to make peace with some people will work with us because of my body, because of one of the coaches' bodies. And my hope is that like you said, we don't share, we don't sell our messaging with our bodies at all, but we live in our bodies. And my hope is that, okay, well, if these people are aesthetically driven, then they come to work with us and they can see there's so much more to it and they move through it. Maybe that's a way of kind of absolving my kind of guilt in some way. Um, it's really really tough, and it's something I actually navigate on a day-to-day basis. So I think for me, having the conversations with people, because I actually had a conversation with someone last week, and she said, you and one of the coaches are in a lean body. How do you navigate this? Can I get there? And she used this really educated coach herself who was working with me. And I said, well, let's just take this comparison out of it. I understand what you're saying, but our bodies are irrelevant. Can you see why? And then
Mhm.
kind of delve into the conversations. And so for me, it's more about opening up the conversations around it as opposed to stepping back from it.
Mhm.
And I have had these conversations and I've had a lot of backlash from people about it too. And I never know if I'm doing it right, to be honest.
I think it's one of those things that there might not ever be a right with it. I love that you've continued to have those conversations. I think definitely at that time in my life, when that was my full caseload, I did not have the capacity. And I think also I know that I chose one specific therapist really early in my eating disorder recovery who ended up to be not such a helpful person and was on her own journey. But I know I chose her because she was very petite. And I was like, oh my goodness. So then when it started happening to me as a therapist, I was like, oh my God, what is this little mind virus that's inside all of us? Um, and how do I not participate in this? And the only way I could think of at that time was to move out. And now when it happens, which is very rarely, I have the capacity to, I think, have more of the response that you have, which is to get curious and be very compassionate instead of deeply frightened, which is my response at the start.
Absolutely. Well, you went that way back in the day. I went the complete opposite way where I was like, no, screw this. I'm going to just plaster my body everywhere. That's my
Okay.
solution, which, was not the most helpful answer.
We went opposite ways. I thought I would circle back, and so I am going to and ask you about the infusion of diet culture in wellness, because sometimes now when I speak to my younger clients and they are struggling a little bit, or I'm noticing some eating disorder, disordered eating tendencies, and I ask them about diet culture, and I have this moment where I'm just hit with a little bit of ageism, and they're like, "What are you talking about? Like that died in the at Y2K. Come on, like what's going on?" Um,
Um,
and I have to kind of unpack wellness culture as it's presented, which has gone from being a very feminist oriented, intuitive embodiment, holistic concept and practice into just a patriarchal dominated capitalist, measurement oriented experience. How you kind of frame wellness culture to your clients and kind of, start to pull back the curtain for them that actually a lot of this is just diet culture repackaged.
I mean, I pretty much say it. I'm
Okay.
quite vocal about it now, especially as it's become more and more, ultimately more and more male driven, actually.
Yeah.
I find that really quite grotesque that we've kind of fallen into the space now. It's become very much about micromanaging things again. And I've spoken about this quite a few times. It is diet culture repackaged as health, and it's hyper privileged. It's,
Mhm.
if you have this probiotic versus this probiotic, then you'll heal your gut and then it will look like this. It's just it's a new focus. It's a new way to micromanage your food intake. It's a new way to micromanage your body, whether it's about weight loss or whether it's about your gut microbiome. It's all the same. It's all, let's take your attention away from your life and put it onto your food, and we'll just call it something else. And so I navigate it by being as transparent as I possibly can. And I actually often, I don't share my opinion on a lot of things, but this is something that I will regularly share my opinion on. I'm not a fan of call out culture, so to speak, but I will certainly call out general topics in the area, podcasts, etc. And I think there's a huge issue at the moment with podcast nutrition, podcast health
Mm.
information at the moment. I think it's a horrible place to be. I think especially some of the biggest podcasts in the country, they platform these people who have, a lack of an evidence base for starters, and often target women.
Yeah.
We have chiropractors targeting women and saying that they need to manipulate their hormones in some way. So we've got, women saying, okay, I need to train like this or eat like this or fast like this at this time of my cycle. And feeling like a failure because they didn't fast in their luteal phase, like this chiropractor told them to do. And it's so toxic that the only way that I feel like I can kind of counteract it or navigate it with clients is kind of more passively on my other outlets like my podcast or my social media, to talk about why it is just this new new focus away from our bodies or diet culture or weight loss in a really disordered way and a lack of evidence way. So I will always just try and unpick the evidence behind all of this stuff. Um, but it's so interesting that you see it with your work as well. And um, a lot of our clients will ask us, they'll come to work with us and they're doing some sort of gut healing protocol at the same time that they've got from someone else, and it's obviously we don't want to, it's not their fault. It's not people's quote unquote fault that they've paid hundreds of pounds to have their poo analysed. Why would they know that it's not evidence-based? That's not up to them to figure it out. It's
Yeah.
up to these people who are selling it. But it's hard because you've got medical doctors and people with PhDs in completely different fields selling this stuff um, and glamorizing it. And
Yeah.
again, because it's so hyper privileged, and a lot of the marketing around it are using potentially influencers and people who are also hyper privileged, and it
Mhm.
becomes like this admirable thing and this inspirational point to get to, that you can drink a probiotic every morning, or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So I think it's really just about unpacking the biases that we have around it as well.
Absolutely. That has always been something that, as I've seen it grow, that's been so discombobulating for me. I have an older brother who was very, very sick when I was a little kiddo. My mom pulled him out of Western medicine, and she just went full tilt into like all the weird stuff. I mean, like, like sprout sandwiches and seaweed wraps and homeopaths and just like we were in the deep dive as a little
Oh.
kiddo. So it was really interesting to watch this stuff come back. About I started noticing it about 10 years ago. And obviously growing up in a household that was so health focused, I had my period where I was just like, I'm not doing any of this. Please
Mhm.
give me another Big Mac. Like I had that time that I needed that, and I was really resistant to it. And it's been really interesting to watch the things that were not associated to wealth. We didn't have wealth growing up. I lived in a very, money was really challenging, to watch these things come back when actually there is no wealth or status associated to a lot of them. A lot of them are quite simple. You don't need a lot. And that for me has always been really discombobulating. And as you were speaking, it just reminded me of like how much capitalism is so rooted in the wellness world now, and how it has taken things that are quite value neutral or quite simple and actually quite easy in many ways, and just turn them into this like massively complex thing for people. And then there's like a further expectation that somehow the consumer or the person who's struggling knows how to navigate the system as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I remember seeing a podcast, a huge podcast, actually got taken down. A reel from a big podcast that a woman was saying, actually another chiropractor, and she was saying, I've had clients who have healed stage 4 cancer and without Western medicine, just by thinking differently. And my brother is living with cancer, and I was extremely triggered. So I sat with it for a couple of days just to make sure it wasn't my own bias. And then I went in because I just thought, this is disgusting, and this is making you, podcast host with millions of listeners, a lot of money through advertising by bringing someone on here who is so engrossed in wellness culture, who says you can think your way out of stage 4 cancer. It's absolutely hideous, and it's really hard not to get angry about it and to approach it in a compassionate way. And I do believe people are doing the best they can from where they are. When I see things like that, it's very difficult to keep that mindset, that compassionate mindset. And I think for anyone like just trying to be curious about, oh, what are these people getting from
Yeah,
saying this? And are they making space for all of the other contributors to health? Did they even mention socioeconomic factors as an
absolutely.
example? Is that
Yeah.
ever been something that they've discussed? Or are they saying, just think your way out of it? Think your way out of it and want it enough, and invest in me at the same time. And if they are, then there's a big red flag there.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many things I want to say, so I'm just keeping them inside. But the last little piece I wanted to touch on with you was, I've started to notice in the embodiment realm, and I know that's not language you use with your clients, but this similar thing is starting to happen that happened to wellness culture, of like just use this wearable tech device and like you'll have a deeper connection to your body, or like just come to my very expensive fitness class and you'll have an emotional release and somehow like you'll be connected to your body. And I'm like, no, you're just going to be spiked with adrenaline and cortisol, peak out of your window of tolerance, drop to the bottom, shut down, have a nice oxytocin high. And like that is not connecting to your body. Like you did do something, but like embodiment was not the thing.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you started to notice the realm of embodiment or somatics start to be co-opted in the same way that wellness was co-opted by diet culture, and how you maybe push back against that if you do, or how you've started to navigate it. And I'm asking, yes, on this podcast, but also a little bit more personally and professionally, because it's something that I'm kind of struggling with right now.
It absolutely is. You just have to look up what's the hashtag. Somatic experiencing, I think, is a hashtag that has always millions and millions of
Oh,
hits.
Peter, it's so
It,
sad his work went that way. Not him, but just, yeah.
and it is sad. It is sad. And um yes, I've definitely noticed it. And I don't know what the answer is other than people like yourself, Katie, who works with us, who's a neurosomatics coach, really again consistently presenting the evidence behind it. And it's so interesting actually, because when she started to work with us as a team, who's Katie's more educated in the somatic realm than I am, I realized that even myself had probably fallen into a little bit of that realm because they were the easiest narratives, and I didn't have the depth of understanding at that point. And she said, you can't blanket statement any of this stuff. And I think that was one of the first things she said to me was like, you're saying these things might move you down from, this hyper aroused state that you're feeling, right? And she'd say, but well, that might work for one person, but not for the other person. So you can't say, let's use these tools. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting way of putting it. It's actually the way that I'd been taught from another embodiment specialist, but that's obviously a different way of doing things. And I think so. I've certainly seen it, and I think that we all have to hold ourselves accountable a little bit. And I certainly have to how I discuss it. I don't think that there's. I don't think it's a shame. I don't think there's an answer. I think it's going to go that way. And like anything, it's about the people who don't know better, um, having these conversations and what's a shame is that a lot of the time it's people like yourself who are you're not somebody who is engrossed in call out culture and you focus on putting out good value information. The problem with this, and I try and I'm usually the same, the problem with it is that it's the people that then these people get away with it, right? Because they keep doing it and we say, but we'll just keep putting out, we're not going to waste our time on that. We're going to keep putting out the stuff that has a good impact, which is so important. But then these people usually are very opinionated. They're very dichotomous. They're very like, their engagement therefore is much higher. Their voices are louder. And so we're over here, putting out the good work. And these people are just over there spouting out their really opinionated thoughts, making millions and taking advantage of people. And so I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if that's just capitalism and we just have to go, this is the world that we live in, or if we have to go, do you know what, we're going to start saying this more because these people are getting away with it. I actually don't know.
I love that you bring that up. I will say that those people, in air quotes, at the
Yeah.
like ethereal beings out there, and how just more generally, I can actually speak to that, how somatics has been presented online, the lack of training, the fact that somatic is put in front of words that just don't actually make sense. I'm like, if you actually took the time to look this up, you would know that you can't actually make that somatic because it's actually inherently somatic. But that's fine. Um, I just let it go. But seeing that is exactly why I created this podcast, because I was like, this is not going to help anyone get into their body, because I actually did all that when I started my eating disorder recovery. After I tried all the wearable devices, I tried all the fitness classes, and it led me nowhere. And I've seen that again and again with my clients, is that creating a connection with your body is deeply personal. It's messy, doesn't fit on a to-do list. It takes time. It requires personalized support, which is one of the reasons why I really love what you do. Is it is, there is no one size fits all, and it holds that space. So that's how it's motivated me. So those people over there are how somatics is framed. You are why this podcast is created, and you're why I'm writing a book. So I
Yeah.
guess.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah,
Uh,
you're so right. I remember I got asked to advise on a new app development actually, and they were doing exactly that. They didn't use the word somatics, but they were saying, "We value you because you do a lot of holistic work. We'd love you to come on." And then they showed me what they were doing, and it was all trackable, tracking your meditation minutes, just tracking everything. And I said, "This is not what you're trying to do. You're saying one thing, but you're doing the other." My advice would be to scrapple and see, well, that's not what we do on this app. That the point is that we want to be able to track all. And then in the end, I didn't
yeah.
go down that road because ultimately money comes first, and
Yeah.
they weren't willing to take that on board, or maybe the lack of understanding,
Yeah.
maybe.
And if you want to track, that's truly all fine and dandy. It just doesn't fit in actually an embodiment framework or a somatic framework.
Yeah,
Thank you so
exactly.
much for your time today. It was so lovely to get to spend this time with you, ask some questions, and learn from you. I'm always really grateful to get to learn from a guest. Um, all your information so people can connect with you will be in the show notes. Do you have anything coming up in the next like 6 to 9 months that you would like people to know about?
Um, Thank you for having me, first of all. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, I actually do. So two things. If you're somebody who is a coach, or you work in the field and you don't want to be a diet culture coach, but you want to work with people more holistically, then I run a course called EIQ Nutrition, which is actually relaunching in the new year. We work with people, personal trainers who want to provide a much better service and apply these kind of principles around things like mindfulness, etc., to their nutrition with their clients. So that's launching in the new year. And also, if you're someone who struggles with overeating, we actually run a really accessible course. One of my keys for 2024 was to have more impact and to be more accessible to people. And so we do run like an 8-week program a couple of times a year that's specifically focused on a lot of this work. So we do some stuff around nervous system regulation, that because we have a team of specialists in different areas, we can make sure we're actually given the right information. And we work on things like nervous system regulation, self-compassion, body image, and it's all packaged into an 8-week program that feels much more accessible than maybe going through a one-to-one course might be. And that will be launching in January or February again. So all of that information will be on my website and social media.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time today. If you found value in this episode, it would mean so much to me for you to share the podcast with friends, a loved one, or on your social platforms. If you have the time, please rate and review the podcast so that this podcast reaches a larger audience and can inspire more and more humans to connect to their bodies too. Thank you for being here and nurturing the relationship you have with your very own